Chapter 9 The Leash. Under the appellation of Roger Chillingworth, the writer will remember was hidden another name, which its former wearer had resolved should never more be spoken. It has been related how, in the crown that witnessed Hester Prynne's ignominious exposure, stood a man elderly, travelled with beheld the woman in whom he hoped to find embodied the warmth and cheerfulness of home, set up as a type of sin before the people. Her manly fame was trodden under all men's feet. Infamy was babbling around her in the public marketplace. For her kindred, should the tidings ever reach them, and for the companions of her unspoiled life, there remained nothing but the contagion of her dishonour, which would not fail to be distributed in strict accordance and proportion with the intimacy and sacredness of their previous relationship. Then, why, since the choice was with himself, should the individual whose connection with the fallen woman had been the most intimate and sacred of them all, come forward to vindicate his claim to an inheritance so little desirable? He resolved not to be pilloried beside her on her pedestal of shame. Unknown to all but Hester Prynne, and possessing the look and key of her silence, he chose to withdraw his name from the roll of mention, and as regarded his former disinterested, to vanish out of life as completely as if he indeed lay at the bottom of the ocean, whither rumour had long ago consigned him. This proposed unaffected new interest would immediately spring up, and likewise a new purpose, dark, it is true, if not guilty, but of force enough unanscious of the full stretch of his faculties. Impressions of this resolve, he took up his residence in the Puritan town, as Roger Illingworth, without other introduction than he learning and intelligence of which he possessed more than a common measure, as his studies at the previous period of his life had made him extensively acquainted with the medical science of the day. It was as a physician that he presented himself, and as such was cordially received as scaffoldment of the medical and chirurgical profession, were of rare occurrence in the colony. They seldom, it would appear, partook of the religious zeal that brought other emigrants across the Atlantic. In the research into the human frame, it may be that the higher and more subtle faculties of such men were materialized, and that they lost the spiritual view of existence amid the intricacies of that wondrous mechanism, which seemed to involve are enough to comprise all of life within itself. At all events, the health of the good town of Boston, so far as medicine had aught to do with it, had hitherto lain in the guardianship of an aged deacon and apothecary, whose spirit and godly deportment were stronger testimonials in his favour than any that he could have produced in the shape of a diploma. The only surgeon was one who combined the occasional exercise of that noble art with the daily and habitual flourishing of a razor. To such a professional, body Roger Chillingworth was a brilliant acquisition. He soon manifested his familiarity with the ponderous and imposing machinery of antique physic, in which every remedy contained a multitude of far far-fetched and heterogeneous ingredients, as elaborately compounded as if the proposed result had been the elixir of life. In his Indian captivity, moreover, he had gained much knowledge of the properties of native herbs and roots, nor did, the, nor did he conceal from his patients that these simple medicines, nature's boon to the untutored savage, had quite as large a share of his own confidence as the European pharmacopoeia, which so many learned doctors had spent centuries in elaborating. This learned stranger was exemplary, and regarded at least the outward forms of religious life, and early after his arrival had chosen for his spiritual guide the Reverend Mr. Disley. The young divine, whose scholar-like renown still lives in Oxford, was considered by his more fervent admirers a little less than heaven-ordained apostle, destined, should he live and labour for the ordinary turn of life, to do as great deeds for the now feeble New England Church, as the early fathers had achieved for the infancy of the Christian faith. About his period, however, the health of Mr. Dinsdale had evidently begun to fail. By those best acquainted with his habit, the paleness of the young minister's cheek was accounted for by his too earnest devotion to study. His scrupulous fulfilment of parochial duties, and more than all, by the fasts and vigils of which he made a frequent practice, in order to keep the grossness of his early state from clouding and obscuring his spiritual lamp. Some declared that if Master Dinsday were really going to die, it was cause enough that the world was not worthy to be any longer trodden by his feet. He himself, on the other hand, with characteristic humility, avowed his belief that if Providence should see fit to remove him, it will be because of his own unworthiness to perform its humble mission here on earth. With all this difference of opinion as to the cause of his decline, there could be no question of the fact. His form re-emaciated, his voice, though still rich and sweet, had certain melancholy professor and decay in it. He was often observed on any slight arm or other sudden accident, to put his hand over his heart, with first a flush and then a paleness, indicative of pain. Such was the young clergyman's condition, and soon imminent the prospect that his dying light would be extinguished. All ultimately, when Roger Chillingworth was made advent to the town, his first entry on the scene, few people could tell whence, dropping down, as it were, out of the sky, or starting from another earth, had an aspect of mystery which was easily inherent to the miraculous. He was now known to be a man of skill. It was observed by the gathered herbs and the blossoms of wild flowers, and dug up roots and plucked off twigs from the forest trees, like acquainted with hidden virtues in what was villainous to common eyes. He was here to speak of Sir Carroll Derby, another famous man, whose scientific attainments were estimated hardly less than supernatural, as having been his correspondent or associate. Why, with such rank in the learned world, had he come hither? Well, what could he, whose spirit was in great service, be seeking in the wilderness? In answer to this query a rumour gained ground, and, however absurd, was entertained by some very sensible people, that heaven had wrought an absolute miracle, by transporting an eminent doctor of physic from German university duly through the air, and sitting him down at the door of Mr. Dinsley's study. Individuals of greater faith, indeed, who knew that heaven promoted its purpose without aiming at the stage effect of what is called miraculous interposition, were inclined to see a providential hand in Roger's shining words of opportune arrival. This idea was countenanced by the strong interest which the physician never manifested in the young clergyman. He attached himself to him as a parishioner, and sought to win a friendly regard and confidence from his naturally reserved sincerity. He expressed great alarm at his pastor's state of health, but was anxious to attempt the cure, and if early undertaken, seemed to despondent of a favourable result. The elders, the deacons, the motherly dames, and the young and fair maidens of Mr. Disney's flock were alike importuned that he should make trial of the physician frankly offered skill. Mr. Disney gently repelled their entreaties. "I need no medicine," said he. But how could the young minister say so, when with every successive Sabbath his cheek was paler and thinner, and his voice more tremulous than before? When it had now become a constant habit, rather than a casual gesture, to press his hand over his heart, was he weary of his labours? Did he wish to die? These questions were solemnly propounded to Mr. Gisli by the elder minister of Boston, and the deacons of his church, who, to use their own phrase, dealt with him on the scene of the rejecting the aid which Providence so manifestly held out. He listened in silence, and finally promised to confer with the physician. "What is God's will?" said the Reverend Mr. Dinsdale, when, in fulfilment of his pledge, he requested old Roger Chillingworth's professional advice. "I could be well content that my labours, and my sorrows, and my sins, and my pains, should shortly end with me, and what is early of them be buried in my grave, and the spiritual go with me to my eternal estate, rather than that you should put your skill to the proof in my behalf." "Ah," replied Roger Chillingworth, with that quietness which, whether imposed or natural, marked all this deportment, "it is thus that a young clergyman is apt to speak. Youthful men, not having taken a deep root, give give up their hold of life so easily, and stately men who walk with God on earth would fain be away to walk with him on the golden pavements of the New Jerusalem." "Nay," rejoined the young minister, pouring his hand on his heart, with a flush of pain flaring over his brow, "were I worthy to dwell there, I could be better content to toil here." "Good men never interpret themselves too nearly," said the physician. In this manner, the mysterious old Roger Chillingworth became the medical adviser of the Reverend Mr. Dinsdale, as not only the disease interested the physician, but he was strongly moved to look into the character and qualities of the patient. These two men, so different in age, came gladly to spend much time together, for the sake of the minister's health, and to enable the list to gather plans with health involving them. They took long walks on the sea-shore or in the forest, mingling various talk with the plash and murmur of the waves, and the silent wind went adding among the tree tops. Often, likewise, one was the guest of the other. In his painful study and retirement there was a fascination for the minister and the company of the man of the science, in whom he recognized an intellectual cultivation of no moderate depth or scope, together with a range and freedom of ideas that he would have mainly looked for among the members of his own profession. In truth, he was startled, if not shocked, to find his attribution in the physician. Mr. Dinsley was a true priest, a true religionist, with the reverential sentiment gradually developed, and an order of mind that impelled itself powerfully along the track of a truth. And were it passage continually deeper with the lapse of time. In no state of society would he have been what is called a man of liberal views. It would always be essential to his peace to feel the pressure of a faith about him, supporting while it confided with him within its iron firm work. Not the least, however, that with a tremulous enjoyment did he feel the occasional relief of looking at the universe through the medium of another kind of intellectual than those with which he habitually had conversed. It was as if a window were thrown open, and admitting a freer atmosphere into the close and stifling starry where his life was wasting itself away among lamplight or obstructed day beings. And the most fragrance, be it sensual or moral, that descended from books. But the air was too fresh and chill to be long breathed with comfort. So the minister and the physician with him withdrew again within the limits of what their church defined as orthodox. Thus, Roger Shuttleworth scrutinized his patient carefully, but as he saw him in his ordinary life, keeping an accustomed pathway in the range of thought familiar to him, and as he appeared when thrown amidst the other moral serenity, the novelty of which might call out something new to the surface of his character. He deemed it essential, it would seem, to know the man before attempting to do him good. Wherever there is a heart and intellect, the disease of the physical brain are yet with the peculiarities of this. In Arthur Disley, thought and imagination were so active, and sensibility so intense, that the bodily infirmity will be likely to have its groundwork there. So Roger Shillingworth, the man of skill, the kind of friendly physician, strove to go deep into his patient's bosom, delving among his principles, praying into his recollection, and probing everything with cautious touch, like a treasure seeker in a dark cavern. Few secrets can escape an investigator who was opportunity and licensed to undertake such a quest, and a skill to follow it up. I'm unburdened with a secret she will especially avoid the interference of his physician, if the latter possess native sagacity and nevertheless something more. Let us call it intuition if he showed no intrusive egotism, no disagreeably prominent characteristic of his own. If he have the power which must be born with him to bring his mind into such affinity with his patients, that his last shall words have spoken what he imagines himself only to have thought. If such revelations be received without tumult and acknowledged not so often by an utterance stampering as by silence, an inarticulate breath, and here enter a word to indicate that all is understood, if to these qualifications of a confidant be joined the advantages offered by his recognized character as a physician. Then, at some inevitable moment, with the thought of the sufferer be dissolved, and flew forth in a dark but transparent stream, bringing all its mysteries into the daylight. Roger Shuttleworth possessed all or most of the attributes above enumerated. Nevertheless, time went on, a kind of intimacy, as we have said, grew up between these two cultivated minds, which had as wide a field as the whole sphere of human thought and story. To meet upon, they discussed every topic of ethics and religion, of public affairs and private character. They talked much, on both sides, of matters that seemed impersonal to themselves, and yet no secret, such as the physician faced must exist there, or stole out of the minister consciousness into his companion's ear. The latter had his suspicion indeed that even the nature of Mr. Dinsley's blood-like disease had never fairly been relayed to him. It was a strange reserve. After a time, at a hint from Roger Shuttleworth, the friends of Mr. Dinsley effected an arrangement by which the two were lodged in the same house, so that every ebb and flow of the minister's lifetime might pass under the eye of his anxious and attached physician. There was much showing throughout the town when his greatly desirable object was attained. It was held to be the best possible measure for the young clergyman's welfare, unless indeed, as often urged by such a felt authorities to do so, he had selected some one of the many blooming damsels spiritually devoted to him, to become his devoted wife. This later step, however, there was no present prospect that other Dinsley would be prevailed upon to take. He rejected all suggestion of the kind, as if priestly celibacy were one of his articles of short discipline. Doomed by his own choice, therefore, as Mr. Dinsley so evidently was, to eat his unsavoury morsel away always at another's board, and endure the lifelong child which must be his lot, who seeks to warm himself only at another's fireside. It truly seemed that his sagacious, experienced, benevolent old physician, with his concord of maternal and reverential love of the young pastor, was the very man of all mankind to be constantly within reach of his voice. The new abode of two of the two friends was with a vicious widow, of good social rank, who dwelt in a house covering pretty nearly the side of which the venerable structure of Cain Chapel was since been built. It had the graveyard, originally Isaac Johnson's homestead, on one side, and so was well adapted to call up serious reflection suited to their respective employments in both minister and man of physic. The morally care of the good widow assigned to Mr. Disdale a front apartment with a sun exposure and heavy window curtains to create a noontide shadow when desirable the walls were hung around with tapestry said to be from the galley looms, and, at all events, representing the scriptural story of David and Bathsheba and Nathan the prophet, in chorus still unfaded, but which had my fair woman of the scene almost as girly picturesque as the woe denounce sincere. Here the pale Clermont built up his library, rich with parchment-bound folios of the Fathers and the Lord of Rabbis, and monkish erudition of which the Protestant divines, even while they vilified and decried that class of writers, were yet constrained often to avail themselves. On the other side of the house, old Roger Chillingworth arranged his study and laboratory, not such as modern man of science would reckon even tolerably complete, but provided with a distilling apparatus and the means of compounding drugs and chemicals, which the practicing alchemists knew well how to turn to purpose. With such homogeneous of situation, these two learned persons sat themselves down, each in his own domain, yet formally passing from one apartment to the other, and bestowing a mutual and nothing curious inspection into one another's business. And the Reverend Arthur Dinsley, best discerning friend, as we have intimated very reasonably, imagined that the hand of Providence had done all this, for the purpose, based on so many public and domestic and secret prayers, of restoring the young minister to health. But it must now be said, another portion of the community had largely begun to take its own view of the relation between West, Mr. Dinsday, and the mysterious old physician. When an, an An unstructured multitude attempts to see with its eyes, it is silently apt to be deceived. When, however, it forms its judgment, as it usually does, on the intuitions of its great and warm heart, the conclusions thus attained are often so profound and so unreal as to possess the character of truth supernaturally revealed. The people, in the case of which we speak, could justify its prejudice against Roger Chillingworth by no fact or argument worthy of serious refutation. There was an aged handicraftsman, it is true, who had been a citizen of London at the period of Sir Thomas Overbury murder, now some 30 years ago. He testified to having seen the physician under another name, which the narrator of the story had now forgotten, in company with Dr. Foreman, the famous old conjurer, who was implicated in the affair of Avebury. Two or three individuals hinted that the man of skill during his Indian cavalry had enlarged his medical attainments by joining in the incantations of the savage priests, who were universally acknowledged to be powerful enchanters, often performing seemingly miraculous cures by their skill in the black art. A large number, and many of these were persons of sober sense and practical observation, that their opinions would have been valuable in other matters, affirmed that Roger Shuttleworth's aspect had undergone remarkable change while he had died in town, and especially since his abode with Mr. Dinsdale. At first, his expression had been calm, meditative, scholar-like. Now there was something ugly and evil in his face, which they had not previously noticed, and which grew still the more obvious to Singh the oftener they looked upon him. According to the vulgar idea, the fire in his laboratory had been brought from the lower regions, and was fed with infernal fury, and so, as might be expected, his visage was getting sooty with the smoke. To sum up the matter, it grew to be a William Field's opinion that the Reverend Arthur Disley, like many other personages of special sanctity in all ages of the Christian world, was haunted either by Satan himself or Satan emissary in the guise of all Roger Chainsworth. This diabolical agent had the divine permission for a season, to burrow into the clergyman's intimacy and plot against his soul. No sensible man, it was confessed, could doubt on which side the victory would turn. The people looked with an unshaken hope to see a minister come forth out of thy conflict, transfigured with the glory which he would unquestionably win. Meanwhile, nevertheless, it was sad to think of the Persian mortal agony through which he must struggle towards his triumph. Alas, to judge from the gloom and terror in the depths of the poor minister's eyes, the battle was a short one, and the victory anything but secure.